Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining me for episode 846 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are resharing our interview with our guest, Dr. Randy Blakely. Listeners, Randy is examining how cells in the brain control chemical signaling with neurotransmitters, as well as how medicinal drugs and drugs of abuse impact neurotransmitters, and how this ultimately impacts behavior in health and in different neurological diseases. Randy shared some great insights and stories about his life and research in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Listeners, today I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. Randy Blakely. So Randy, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
Well, we are delighted to have you with us and to learn more about you and your work. But to start off with, I want to tell our listeners a little bit about your background here. So listeners, Randy is a professor of biomedical science at Florida Atlantic University, and he's also the executive director of the Florida Atlantic University Brain Institute. Randy received his bachelor's degree in philosophy from Emory University and his Ph.D. in neuroscience from the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He next conducted postdoctoral research at the Yale Hughes Medical Institute Center for Molecular Neuroscience. And Randy was an investigator and faculty member at Emory University, as well as at Vanderbilt University, before accepting his current position there at Florida Atlantic University. Randy is the recipient of numerous awards and honors for his research and his mentorship. He was awarded the Daniel Efron Award from the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, 2 Distinguished Investigator Awards from the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation, a Merit Award from the National Institute of Mental Health, a Zenith Award from the Alzheimer's Association, the Delores C. Shockley Partnership Award in recognition of minority trainee mentorship, as well as the Astellas Award in Translational Pharmacology, and the Julius Axelrod Award, both from the American Society for Pharmacology and Experimental Therapeutics. In addition, Randy is a fellow of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science. And listeners, Randy is here with us today to talk about his life and his science. So Randy, we want to know first about what you like to do when you're not doing science.
Well, sometimes it seems like I get very little time to do that. Science is an obsession. It's a drive. But there is some other time. And I guess what I do in the off hours, I like nature. I live in an area with beautiful birds. I live in South Florida, the Everglades. So I see ibises and storks and cranes walking across my yard. So that's always a pleasure. I read quite a bit. Mostly it's audiobooks these days because we have multiple campuses. So I find myself driving between them and listening to those books as well as music. I've lived for 20 years in the Nashville area and I've taken away from that quite a love of music.
Excellent. Now, are you a musician yourself?
Only air guitar and the tapping that I do on my dashboard.
Percussion, yes, that counts. Absolutely. Very cool. So what kind of music?
I like the area of music one might call Americana music. I would say it's folk music, singer-songwriter music. People like John Hyatt, Jason Isbell, Lucinda Williams, Patty Griffin, that kind of builds on a long love of music growing up with the Beatles, the Eagles, Jim Croce, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So mostly singable music. I love lyrics or lyric-driven music and spend quite a lot of time listening to that and trying to get away from political talk radio.
Absolutely. Drown it out with a little bit of music. That's awesome.
Exactly.
So now you mentioned that you're a book aficionado as well. Randy, I love getting book recommendations, and audiobooks absolutely work for me too. So do you have a favorite one that you want me and my listeners to check out?
There are several that come to mind. I love history, and I like military history a bit because of having been an Army brat. But I think just in terms of historical books, I tend to focus on the historical nonfiction rather than fiction. And the books of David McCullough are just hard to beat in the history area, particularly one of his most recent ones, the one on the Wright brothers. he has such a wonderful way of telling a story about the emergence of this amazing technology of flight in a world where no one had seen anybody in the sky. And the idea of someone sitting in a chair and flying across the heavens as you were on the ground watching that, whether that was in a cornfield or in New York, it must have been just a stunning experience. And David can tell it, and in the audiobooks, he reads it. You may remember him from his narration in the Ken Burns' The Civil War series. And he's himself, many don't know, a professional historian. And to hear him read his own books is just an amazing pleasure.
Excellent. Well, we will add this to our website for our listeners to find if they're looking to dig a little bit into history for their next read. And we've talked a little bit about what you like to do when you're outside the lab. But Randy, I do want to talk about your work next. So can you tell us how you describe what you do to someone who's maybe not familiar with neuroscience or specifically your research?
I usually describe to someone that I work on how chemicals work in the brain. I work on a class of chemicals called neurotransmitters, which are very small molecules that neurons use to communicate with each other. And I study how neurons in the brain control that signaling, those molecules, and then how drugs that we either take as medications or abuse, like cocaine or amphetamine, controls those chemicals and their disposition, and how that ultimately changes our behavior. So the work sort of runs the gamut between brain diseases that we think reflect changes in how neurons communicate, or how drugs of abuse modify synapses by changing those neurochemicals.
Very cool. I'm excited to chat more about some of your ongoing projects later in our interview, but I do want to take a moment to chat about motivation. It sounds like you're answering a lot of really interesting questions in the lab, and sometimes that's enough to just get you motivated to go in every day. But I do love to collect quotes and sayings to keep me going. So do you have a favorite, Randy?
I have two that they sound very different, or they're antitheses of each other, but I put them together myself. One is that one person can make a difference and everyone should try. Now, that's from JFK. And I think it means a lot to me because I know that I've had helping hands all the way through my career. And oftentimes it was just that one person that made all the difference in whether I went down the right path or the wrong path, and whether that meant they helped me think through a problem, or that they were the person that really got me a job, or that they gave me an opportunity. And the other one is really the quote from an African proverb that Hillary Clinton used to title her book, which is "It Takes a Village." And that, again, is a quote about human interactions. Here it's a little bit broader and talks about how multiple helping hands put our world together. I like to think about that a lot with respect to our science. We don't live in an age where science is done by a single individual in the corner with a microscope and some peas and a few slides of fish and trying to figure out how something as complicated as the brain works. So it takes a village. For me, it means it takes a lot of people with different kinds of talents working together to solve complicated problems about brain function, brain disease. I also think it reminds me to encourage my trainees to network, to find that community that will support them, that they can collaborate with to make their science all the more important. So in either way, those two quotes sort of frame the social dynamic that I think guides how I think about life and how I think about science.
Absolutely. And I love that you brought up the importance of networking, because I 100% agree that this can be critical in helping you get to the next step in your career path. So for our listeners out there who might not be maybe experts in the art of networking, do you have any advice for them?
Following up on connections that you make. You may meet someone at a meeting. You may be introduced to them at a seminar. You may read their work. And it's often the case that you sort of let that event pass you by and forget to follow up on it. But I've been tickled to have people write me after a seminar and say, I really found this interesting, or I had a question about what you said. And those little acts of reconnecting can often lead in good directions. So it could lead to collaborations. It could just lead to you knowing a little bit more about another person or where they work and live. But I think that reaching back out and making connections and in your professional life, of course, those are incredibly valuable for you to have name recognition by that other person, for you to have someone maybe to follow up later, and maybe you see them after you've just emailed back and forth and you say, oh, you remember me? I sent you that note about so-and-so. And you go, oh, yeah, right, sure. So you have to be proactive about your networking. You can't expect the world to come to your doorstep.
Absolutely. Well, I like that you brought this up, and I think it is definitely an important thing to do in science. And we mentioned this idea of helping hands, and I love this term that you use here. And I'm curious, do you have particular people that really stand out in your mind, Randy, that were helping hands or maybe inspirational figures or mentors for you along your course?
Absolutely. I feel like some days that I've really been the luckiest person ever. I grew up in a smaller community in South Georgia. I grew up a child of essentially a single parent. My dad died when I was 2, and there were 5 kids in the family, and we didn't really have a lot of money. We were, I would say, lower middle class, and sometimes it felt a little bit lower than that. But I had fairly low horizons. I was a smart kid and I could do things, but I really didn't have much in the way of a vision as to where that would take me. And it wasn't until I got into high school and I met a woman named Jane Bland. And Jane was a teacher for me in high school. It's named Jordan Vocational High School. It was named that because it was built in a community of working class people who went to school basically to learn a trade, an honorable one to work in a wood shop or electric shop or to build cars or to go to the cotton mills. It was a working family school. And I had that mentality too and didn't quite know where I would end up. And I happened to meet Jane Bland, who was one of the most intellectual people I've ever met. And for some circumstances, found her way to teach in this school. And I lucked out and wandered into her class one day as a freshman because I had been reassigned out of a class that was really very boring, and I was not happy about being there, and was assigned to her class, which was called vocabulary. And she was an amazing person. She taught this class out of the New York Times, out of the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, out of Shakespeare classics. And she taught us etymology, and she taught us poetry and so many things. And it was all about words and communication. And this is a class typically taken by seniors. I ended up taking it as a freshman and then every year thereafter. And we bonded quite a bit. And by the time I was a senior, I think she was a little bit tired of me being in this class.
You had learned all the vocabulary, so what was left? Right?
Well, she wanted to find some other things for me to do. And I had lucked out and I had a collection given to me of the great books, the book series out of the University of Chicago. And Jane learned that and decided that, well, maybe we should take 4 or 5 of those and make your vocabulary activity for the next year drawn from those books. It was essentially a sneaky way of getting me to learn classics. I loved that. I ended up writing a thesis on Virgil's Aeneid, which for this school and this time, I was quite an odd duck. But she encouraged me to be an intellectual, to think about big ideas, to use my mind. And she was also a very caring person. And she impressed upon me many of the values I have today about the people I interact with and the way I live my life. But Jane encouraged me to go further and go to college. First, I thought I would go to a local community college or a college maybe within 30 or 40 miles of where I lived. Couldn't imagine going someplace like a big city. And I happened to score highly on a national merit test and got a letter from Emory University and essentially offered me a full scholarship to go there. And I thought that was amazing. And I had to ask Jane, where's Emory University?
Oh, wow.
She said, well, that's in Atlanta. And I thought, wow, that's great. I've got to go and find out where this place is. And went up there and fell in love with the place and eventually went to Emory. And because of Jane and the things that she had taught me, I became a philosophy major. That's how I got my degree. Though I think trying to understand what the material basis of our thought process, our brain, was what ultimately drove me into neuroscience. And that moved me along on to a Ph.D. in neuroscience at Johns Hopkins. I should say that also traveling with me at the time was my wife, Leslie. I met her in Jane Bland's class, actually, her vocabulary class. I was 15. She was 17. And we found that we had many, many things in common. We both wanted to grow and experience the world. And we had a love of literature and music. And we continued to date through college and married right after college. I should tell you that I was a Rhodes Scholars finalist at the time, and I didn't get it. And I probably could have been floored by that. I had a lot of hope and expectations. That seemed like such a wonderful thing to do. But I was going to get married in another month or so after the competition ended. And I just remember thinking about that at the time and how happy I was and how excited I was to start this new chapter in my life with Leslie. We went on from there to Baltimore, to Johns Hopkins, and then pursued the rest of our time. And with all of the things that I'd been involved with, that were lots of different activities and leadership positions and all of that, without Leslie, none of this would have happened. She's my bedrock, the person that keeps me sane, the person that reminds me where I came from. And I should say that one of the things I'll always remember about our time together is there was a time when things were a little rocky and we were having some trouble, and I was having some trouble, mainly from working very hard. And Leslie decided that what I needed to do was sort of reconnect with the past. And we took a trip to go back home and to go back to my parents' home back in a farm area in Missouri. And I think that that made such a big difference for me, just to remember my roots. So she's just an incredible person. She has a degree in fine arts and business, and her business degree definitely comes in handy because without that, I think our household would crash and burn, and any of the opportunities I might have to save a little money would be out the door.
Absolutely. Well, Randy, I love that you've tied in all these diverse interests that you've had in terms of literature and history and philosophy, and how everything kind of came together to lead you to pursue neuroscience. And this story is amazing about actually meeting your wife in that vocabulary class with that key mentor. So what I'd like you to tell us more about is what happened when you entered college. What were some of these big steps that helped you get to where you are today?
So I was kind of one of these overachiever kids, and I was doing a lot. I was doing my degree and actually trying to chase down this nascent interest in neurobiology. I hooked up with a couple of faculty members, Daryl Neal and Jay Justice at Emory, and I hung out in their labs, and they were doing work in what we would call psychopharmacology, how drugs act in the brain. For my time, this is the mid-70s. The 1960s, of course, was a big revolution in experimental drug use. And as I grew up, and I certainly learned a lot about the rampant use of experimental drugs, and it always fascinated me as to how they worked in the brain. So I think that fascination drove me to work with them. And then as I was thinking about what to do professionally, I had a personal revelation that really reinforced to me that neuroscience was the path I wanted to go down. And I told you that my dad died when I was 2, and I didn't really know what the circumstances of that death was. In my head, I had it that he had died of a heart attack. Someone may have told me that, I don't know. But I think as I think back about it, I realized that this was something that wasn't talked about in the family. And I knew implicitly that there was a tragedy there, and I didn't want to push the issue. I never wanted to trouble my mother to find out, or my siblings. Just wanted to get on with life. But it was clear that some bad things had happened. And while I was in college, I happened to get sick. I had to go to the doctor, and they asked me some medical questions. And it was an illness that made them wonder about my heart. I said, oh, yeah, my dad died of a heart attack. And they asked me, well, tell us more. How did that happen? And
oh, no.
I said, well, I don't really know. I'll ask my mom. So I called my mom and I said, they want to know about this. Can you tell me more? And there was a dead silence on the phone. And she said, why don't we talk about it when you come home this weekend? And of course, I don't know what day that was, but
sure. Just dreading the rest of the week. Yeah.
Yeah. I had to think, what could this be? And when I got home, my mom said, I'm so sorry. I thought one of your siblings had told you what had happened to your dad. And it turned out that my dad had become seriously depressed and took his life. This was in 1960, a few weeks before Christmas, in a small community, a small town. And the family really received very little by way of comfort or engagement from the community. I think they definitely felt the stigma of something bad having happened and that there were problems with that family and those people. It was really a very difficult time for me trying to process my early life, what had happened along the way. I felt both upset that I hadn't known and, of course, then felt a great sense of support because I knew that my family, my mother, had allowed me to grow up without the same stigma, the same sadness that they had. But it made a lot of sense in my family. I understood now why there were problems with my siblings experiencing their own bouts of depression. And there was more pain in the family that I won't go into, but I understood where that came from a little bit better. But it also made me think a lot about what was going on inside his brain, his mind, and what had pushed him down that dark hole. And that really reinforced for me that neuroscience was the direction I wanted to go. I had formed an interest just out of personal fascination, wanting to understand the basis of our thought process. But I think it pushed me a little bit more to thinking about the value of what I was trying to learn and that there were real people out there with problems and that maybe if I could figure out a little bit more about the brain and dig a little deeper, maybe one day I could help somebody.
Absolutely. Well, Randy, thank you so much for sharing this personal side of your story. And I think nowadays there's a lot more talk about mental health than I'm sure there was at the time. And maybe the stigma is starting to raise a little bit. So it's not as difficult for people to have these conversations. But I think it's something where it's really an important area of research, and depression and other mental health concerns are more common, I think, than a lot of people realize.
Very much so. They're still hidden quite a bit. I think it's not common for people even today in the workplace to talk about the problems that they face. We try to watch for our students and our coworkers and see whether or not we see signs that they're in trouble, that they have needs. And even as adults, we can have our periods of trouble and pain. And there have been several times when I've had friends speak up to me and take me aside and say, what you're doing, the way you're living your life is not healthy for you. As many scientists are, I'm a pretty driven kind of guy, and I get up every day being excited by all the opportunities that are presented to us as mentors, as discoverers and all that. But it can really take hold of you sometimes, and you need a break.
Absolutely. I know I'm guilty myself of overfilling my plate a lot of the time, and I need someone to say, all right, Marie, drop the plate for a second, take a break.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, Randy, I'd love to chat next about some of the projects that you have going on in your lab right now. So is there a favorite one that you have that you want to tell us more about?
We have a lot of different things going on in the lab.
You do.
When people ask me this, I always think about a parent who's got 5 or 6 kids and someone asking them, which is your favorite kid?
Whichever one I saw last. Yep.
Yeah, so that was a little difficult. But I must probably focus on one I think might be the most easy to explain to people as to what it is we're doing and why we're excited about it. This has to do with the neurotransmitter serotonin. Serotonin is one of these brain chemicals, one of these neurotransmitters that acts throughout the brain, actually throughout the body. It has many, many effects, and we often think about it in relation to depression. And in fact, I think that that was what drew me to it initially. And I was a member of a team that identified a gene that inactivates serotonin in the brain. This is a serotonin transporter. You might know of drugs like Prozac or Paxil, those kinds of medications, and they act on a protein that's made by this gene that we discovered now more than 25 years ago. We discovered it and a number of its sibling genes. I've been working on them ever since. And I think that as we studied this gene, we thought that our insights would really move in the direction of better therapies for depression or insights into how depression occurs. And something happened in the mid-2000s that made me think a little bit differently about serotonin, and that's where this current project lies. We found that there were individuals who had mutations in the gene that I just described, the serotonin transporter gene, and these individuals had autism. And there were multiple mutations in the serotonin transporter gene, and all of these mutations essentially did the same thing. They made this transporter, which acts like a little sort of nano vacuum cleaner to get rid of serotonin at your brain synapses. It made that transporter hyperactive, which is a big lesson in genetics to think that mutations don't always kill proteins or disable them. Here was a set of mutations that increase the activity. It's like you were vacuuming your house, and now your vacuum cleaner is extremely powerful. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Maybe I can clean the house a little faster.
I finally get the dog hair out, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, get it out of the couch. However, when that occurs in your brain and you take away too much serotonin, particularly in early brain development, we think that that's a problem. We think that serotonin is needed so that your brain wires up correctly and that synapses form in the right way. So when we saw this, it led to a number of questions for us. How are these changes in this transporter doing this? What was causing them to kick into high gear? And could we come up with a way to slow it down? And this took us a few years to study mechanisms by which this protein is normally regulated in a normal brain. And we happened upon a pathway, a signaling pathway in neurons that does that. It actually pushes this transporter into high gear. And we think that normally this protein needs to sometimes be more active and sometimes be less active. And that's what this pathway does. So that's a lot of basic science that we did, but we did it because if we could figure that out, maybe we could come up with a medication that would slow it down. If people would have a mutation to where they can't control it themselves, maybe a medication might slow it down for them. So we did two things. One was to find a collaborator, a chemist. In this case, it's Marty Watterson up at Northwestern, who was producing drugs or compounds, molecules that could be medications to treat a number of disorders that happen to use the same signaling pathway. And he had one that we thought, well, if we had a model where we could use this drug, you have a test case for reversing the traits of autism. So the next thing we did was to engineer a mouse that carried one of these human mutations. In fact, it's the most common of these. And we found that that mouse showed antisocial behavior. It showed repetitive behavior. It showed communication deficits and some other physiological properties that pointed to us, again, to autism. And then we combined these two findings and we treated those mice with this drug that Marty had made. And we were astonished to find that a number of these traits were eliminated in this mouse model. So here we have, after 25 years and thinking that we were going to be studying depression, we generate something that might one day be able to help people with autism lead a better life. And without the training in molecular biology and pharmacology and biochemistry, I never could have gotten there. And I did all of that with a lot of help along the way, including Jane Bland back in high school.
Very cool. Well, Randy, this is an interesting project, and I'm curious, with the mice studies, does it appear as though there's a window during which you have to administer this treatment? Does it have to be when the mice are young, or can it be at any point?
That's a great question. As many neuroscientists do when they're studying animal models, it's very difficult to work with very young animals. Mouse pups are very dependent on the mother for a period of time during which their brains are developing. And it's very difficult to administer drugs to mouse pups. So we generally have to wait until their young adolescent period. And it's even easier if we just wait until they're adults. So we did our studies actually in adult animals, and we rationalized that a large unmet need is an adult population with autism. Autism doesn't kill you. It stays with you for the rest of your life. You may be able to deal with your symptoms effectively, but the disease, the disorder is still there. So we just tried our drug on our adult animals, and we were impressed at how much we could reverse, particularly some of their social behavior deficits in adult animals. And that told us that this circuitry or the signaling that's changed in their brains is not irreversible. There are functional changes that if we know enough, we can actually change ourselves and reverse some of the problems that they may be faced with. So in this particular case, the changes I've told you about, the antisocial behavior, some of the physiological changes we can induce in adulthood. Now, there are some other things that emerge in these animals that we think are probably changes that do occur in very early development. There's some GI abnormalities. It turns out that's a common complaint of individuals with autism. And our mice have them too. And there are changes in the way there's an intrinsic nervous system in the gut that helps you with peristalsis and gut contraction and how your intestines work. And that nervous system's development is dependent on serotonin very early. And by the time we get to it as an adult or in our adult mice, there are a few things that may be modifiable, but we suspect that many things are not. And you actually, in those cases, need to treat the mother while the animal is pregnant to affect a full reversal of those symptoms. So some success on the behavioral side, maybe less so on some of the other sides, but we'll take a partial victory. Right. We really have very little to offer individuals with autism right now in terms of treatment. So we've been very excited about the positive side of what we found.
Well, this is phenomenal, Randy. I'm excited to hear more about this project and read up on it in my spare time. But I do want to talk about some of the challenges and the downsides. And it's not all victories every day, as some people might see when they look at science in the media. So do you have a favorite story of failure or challenge or struggle, or maybe one you're going through right now that you want to tell us about?
I think there's struggles all along the way. There are times when you wonder whether or not you're going to be able to follow your passions. And maybe it's just that you're not lucky, or you haven't figured out exactly how to do the experiment the right way. And it can become quite depressing, particularly when you're a young person. I think that the most important thing that I've found is just that I've relied on others to talk through those challenges and always been reminded that if I really love what I'm doing, then life's an experiment in and all of itself. Let's just play it out and see how it goes. And each time I've gotten to that point, I've usually found a path where I could see success along one side of it. The whole thing might not be achievable as much as I thought, the whole large experiment, but some part of it was a success, and then to follow that. And that's paid off a number of times.
Definitely, you have to celebrate those partial victories, like we said.
It's true, and you can't plot this out. It is very, like I said with the autism story, who would have thought that that would have been where we would go? And yet you keep your eyes open, you look at what you're finding, and you follow that lead. And that's what many scientists do to guide themselves. It's not a plan as much as we have to in writing grants to fund our work. Many things are not predictable in what we do. And we are fortunate that we have a funding system in the National Institutes of Health, which doesn't expect us to write an ironclad contract to get funding. We need to be able to demonstrate that we have the capacity to do the experiments that we want to do, but they also trust us that we are bright enough, resourceful enough, and have a great enough ability to chase down other leads. And if they lead us somewhere else, then we can follow those things. Of course, if it deviates too far from our plans, we need to talk about that. with our NH program officers, in case any of them are listening. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I do.
All the time, yes.
But we are allowed to be adventurous. And I think that has helped me many, many times. And I also think it pays to be optimistic. In science, I don't know how you can face down a lot of dead-end experiments and a lot of repetitive work without a sense of optimism that after this, things are going to be better or more interesting, or you can see where this could take you. So I think you need vision, you need collaboration, and you need some pluck and some optimism.
Absolutely. An ability to maybe step back and look at the bigger picture and how it all fits together, I think helps sometimes when you're stuck on one very tiny thing. So Randy, we've mentioned a couple times these partial successes that sound like great victories, but do you have a favorite success story that you want to tell us about today?
I think that my proudest successes are those young people that have come through my lab and now lead productive lives of their own, careers of their own. In some cases, run very well-established laboratories. Sure, the science and the success and the grants and the awards and all of that is certainly gratifying, but it's not much better than to have trainees that have come through your lab and themselves have taken away a sense of personal confidence, of imagination, of optimism. I've had over 30 Ph.D. students come through my lab at this point, probably as many postdoctoral fellows, and I've even had faculty that come visited the lab and work with us and that still work with us. So all of these people today and their successes, I think, really motivate me in the end the most. Trying to repay the help that I was given as I grew up and as I became a professional.
Absolutely. And I think mentoring is a big part of the life of a scientist, and you've received some awards for your excellence in mentoring, of course. So do you have any maybe particular approaches that you use when mentoring students or things that you found particularly helpful for yourself?
You have to encourage your trainees to be independent, to be free thinkers. You have to show them that you appreciate their intellects and their own passions. And it's wonderful to engage with your trainees over what findings mean in terms of their importance in the field or how they fit into the literature, and to just see them grow as people, to talk with them about life experiences. I think sometimes we probably don't listen to what they've done in their lives and how that is working for them. But I also think you have to give them some examples of experiences that you've had and how they have changed the way you have pursued your craft and where you've made decisions. For example, when I was in college, deciding that neuroscience was what I would like to do, I was still thinking about doing that through a medical education. I would become a doctor, I thought, and it took me quite a long time to realize that that wasn't me. My passion was to do research. And yes, it would be translational. It would focus on some aspects of brain disorders. But I was really much more the sort of an inquisitive, driven kind of person to figure out how things worked. So basic science was more important for me and my career choice. And in fact, it was sort of a week before classes started for medical school that I just feverishly said, this is not for me. Randy, you are not really interested in being a physician.
Oh, wow.
So I went to the dean of the medical school, and I felt really bad because I had been part of a fellowship program for early admittance into medical school. And this was funded by the Macy Foundation. And that foundation wanted to attract humanists, more people with humanities training into medical school. And part of that encouragement to do that, to then come into medical school, was that they provided you with monies for foreign travel. And I can tell you that how I'd grown up would not have provided those kinds of money. So I studied in Greece and I followed my passion for the classics. And here I was coming to the dean of the medical school and say, despite that investment, I cannot go to medical school. It is not what I need to do. He said, Randy, don't worry about it. I have a whole bunch of people that want to come to medical school. Mm-hmm. So don't worry. We've got somebody to fill your
We'll fill the slot. Yeah.
That was a relief. And he heard me out. And I think maybe he even helped me in some way that I don't really know, because I did find a place to go at Emory to work in a biology lab for a couple of years while I got my career reoriented to go to grad school. And that took me on to Hopkins for a graduate degree in neuroscience. And what was still a very young field, neuroscience was just beginning to be embraced as its own discipline and to have its own Ph.D. programs. And Johns Hopkins had one of the first and foremost Ph.D. programs oriented around psychopharmacology, which I had grown to love.
Absolutely. So now we talked about this opportunity that you had to travel to Greece to study. And I think travel is a big part of life of a scientist. So Randy, is there a particular place that you remember going that was just your absolute favorite that you want to tell us about?
At my age, I'm now a full professor, so I've traveled quite a bit. So there's so many stories about travel. In terms of favorite places, I would have to say that there are two places that stand out. One is Erice in Sicily. Erice has a monastery turned into a conference center on top of a mountain that you have to drive up to in the heights of Sicily above Palermo. And I did that. I arrived there for a meeting, and I got there late at night. It was dark and it was cloudy. I could see very little of anything. And I took a taxi way up the top of this mountain, checked into my room, waiting the meeting to start the next morning. And I got up and the clouds had vanished and mist was gone. And I opened up the windows of my room, this sort of classic double wooden gates to your window, and opened those up. And I looked out and I was looking over the ocean, almost to being able to see the boot of Italy from Sicily. We were so high up.
Oh, wow.
And it was a magnificent view. It was stunning. I'll never forget that view. And it was a wonderful meeting. And we've had several opportunities to go there and to go to other places in the Mediterranean. And perhaps just my time spent there in college and my love of classical thought and literature always makes that a very compelling memory for me. And hope I can go back there soon.
Absolutely. Now, you mentioned there were two places. What's the second one?
Well, the second one is a shorter vignette about a place that I went to this past summer. I organized a meeting on the class of proteins that I study, along with several other colleagues. And it was in a town called Maintenon, which is south of Paris, about an hour and a half, and a very small hotel that lies in the shadow of a French chateau. And the grounds of this chateau were designed by the same person that designed Versailles Gardens. So another magnificent, beautiful spot. Our accommodations were fine. It was not the Ritz, but it didn't matter because you could walk out the door and walk into the grounds of this chateau and be transported back to the 17th and 18th century. It was just gorgeous. And it made such a context for the meeting. And I think this is something that many who consider a career in science and perhaps might be discouraged about it doesn't necessarily pay a whole lot. When it does, that takes a long time in your career to get to a point where your salary is what you would like it to be. But we do get to travel to many, many beautiful places as part of our career to communicate our science with our colleagues. And those are just two beautiful places that I've been out of many.
Wonderful. I definitely love highlighting this international nature of careers in science. So I'm really glad you brought up these two places that you've been to. And we talked about some of the different things that you've done over the course of your career. And one thing that I also love to highlight are some of the people that you get to work with. And I think there are so many different personalities in people in science, and we don't necessarily fit the stereotypes that many people have of scientists. So I love sharing stories of fun traditions or funny memories and other things that really highlight this human side of science or highlight science as a social endeavor. So do you have a story that you can share with us today, Randy?
Well, thinking about some of the fun things that happen in science, I certainly have a lot of colleagues that, like me, I suspect maybe seem kind of dry or focused on the serious aspects of our work, but deep down we have a little mirth in us and occasionally like to play games or to entertain our friends or our students. We have a little tradition that's happened in the lab with some exceptions, but often I enjoy doing something a little bit funny for my students when they defend their degrees, which is a formal event where they present the work of their thesis. But it's important, I think, for people to have a little levity in their life, and I usually like to introduce them with something that's maybe unexpected about the person that they're going to hear about, but do it in a little bit of a funny way. And so I've generated some videos and some fun ways of talking about them. I'll tell you 2 instances. One was a student that I kept trying to scratch my head, and I didn't want to give her the introduction of she was born here and she did this and she did that. So I thought that I would just come up with a video that I would put together that would be based around the idea that I really didn't want to let her go, and why had her committee actually allowed this to happen. And I happened to run across a video, maybe you've seen it, of one of Hitler's rants, where he is ranting to his generals about why the army has been annihilated. And I'd seen that others had dubbed over humorous English translations of what was being said. And I did the same thing for this introduction. Mm-hmm. And basically screamed at the members of my committee in that movie, of course, and now with Hitler doing the duty. And then ultimately used that to tell some facts about this student and where she had come from, what her aspirations were, and then ultimately wish her well through that video. So that was one example. Another one that was more recent was for a young man who's an Indian fellow who was getting his degree. And at that time, the movie Slumdog Millionaires had come out, of course, set in India. And you may recall is centered around a young man playing the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Mm-hmm. So there are many questions that the young man has to answer. So in this case, I'd had a new Indian student join the lab. So I got him to be the young man who was in the contest. And I played on the screen various questions about my soon-to-defend Ph.D. student that would tell the life of this young man. For example, where was he born? And there were a number of options, and the contestant, my new student, would have to guess. And of course, he would go through, and then using that process of serially going through a few examples, we pretty much elaborated the background of this student. There was a little light Indian music, and we had some fun with that. So that then led to him coming up and then defending his thesis. So we've had a little bit of a tradition of doing that. I think now the expectations are so high for me to try to pull one of those off. And new job, I'm pretty busy. So
keep raising the bar, Randy. I don't know.
It'll take a little while before I get back to that. But those have been a lot of fun and return a little bit the joy that the students have given me.
Well, I love that you introduced the fun and the humor in on this, what is usually a very stressful day for the students. I know I would have appreciated a laugh before I started. So we chatted about your lab a little bit and some of the amazing work that you're doing there. And I'm curious, if we gave you everything, Randy, all the funding, the staff, the technology, whatever feasibility things you needed, what is the one question that you are most interested in tackling?
I think that all of the work that I've done is centered around genetics in some form or fashion, and genetics as it affects the brain chemistry, how drugs act. And I think that that ultimately pulls me into individual differences and how very slight variations in our genes can make very substantial differences in our brains and how our brains work and behavior. And I would love to be able to see how two people who marry, have children, and their children now carry the genetic variation of their parents. And that slight variation in different ways is going to affect how their child's brain develops. And I would love to be able, in a fantasy, to follow all of this genetic variation that's in tens of thousands of genes, in hundreds of thousands of proteins, in millions of synapses, and how that winds its way into changes in synapses, changes in behavior. And so the ability to monitor all of that genetic variation and its impact across time in the living brain, trying to figure out how you could do that, how you could follow all of that information. We're in an age now that we talk a lot about big data because we can measure so many things simultaneously. And major challenge is going to be to follow that in time as the brain develops. So to understand what makes us individuals, what makes us unique, certainly it's not all about genetics, and I would put a big emphasis here on how the environment impacts all of that genetic variation. But at least it's a foundation for receiving those environmental influences. So to be able to monitor and follow differences in genes and proteins that change how our brains develop and how behavior is emitted, that would just be the ultimate for me. And I study a few genes and a few proteins and a few networks that these genes work in. And to explode that up now to what really happens in a developing brain with hundreds of millions of connections all growing and working at the same time, that would be astounding.
Absolutely. Well, I love the intergenerational aspect of this proposed fantasy study you have here. I think that's something that you're absolutely right is missing, because I think our technology advances have come so far in the past couple of generations even that it's hard to even start pulling that data with the data we're getting now because it's so much better.
We get so much data, and yet it's still most of the time not dynamic across the lifespan, right? We have to take slices and snapshots. Mm-hmm. And even then, it's incredibly dense and complicated. So to watch it move and change over time as we grow would be an amazing opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for dreaming big with us today, Randy. And we've talked about different aspects of your career. And I think one thing that keeps coming up in our conversation is these helping hands, these people that you've encountered who've helped you along your journey. And I want to ask you to help our listeners along their journey today. Randy, is there one piece of advice that you can pass on to them that really helped you?
I think it's to trust yourself and your own insights and to take lessons from other people and then know where your limitations are and go and try to make sure that those limitations don't keep you from following what really are your own passions. Sometimes I think we will not understand something and then we sort of move to a different question or a different approach. And I think when you don't understand something, there's the time to stop and dig a little deeper and find out what is it you don't understand and how do you do that? You can do that on your own. You may have to, but you can do that with other people as well. And as I sort of stressed before, I think that can be incredibly productive, incredibly enjoyable. When we run into problems, when we run into the unknown, that we should treat as an opportunity. Otherwise, we just sort of go along happily, whistling merrily, and think we know everything. And it's when we encounter problems, when we encounter the unknown, that we really now find the opportunity to learn more, to dig in deep, and use science to test our ideas about something. Is what I know really valid? Do I need to change the concepts that I have? So I think scientists that I know that are successful really enjoy a problem. And it's partly because it will challenge them to work a little bit harder, dig a little bit deeper. And that's actually where all the fun comes in science.
Definitely. And I like that you pointed out also that you can ask for help. And I think a lot of times people are hesitant or maybe embarrassed to say that they don't understand something and to seek help. But connecting with these people who are experts, these potential collaborators, can be really beneficial. It's
true. When I give a lecture and someone introduces me, as you did, with lots of accolades and whatnot, and I like to remind the audience a quote I heard once, that an expert is defined as a person that doesn't know anything more than you do, but they're from out of town. One aspect of that is that there's expertise all around you. There are people who know many, many things if only you took the time to explore what it is they can help you with. And in reverse, when I go out and I'm the expert and I'm supposed to be coming to give a lecture, I remind myself all the time how smart people are everywhere. There are smart people everywhere. And sometimes they, for one reason or another, have taken a different path. They may be not doing active research anymore, but they're brilliant in their own way, and taking the time to learn from people has always been returned to me with insights and lessons. And so that's one of the great things about traveling around to visit with other scientists and their communities, is that you realize what a large body of intelligent people are out there, and it's so much fun to interact with them.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful message to pass on to our listeners, Randy. Is there any other last note or piece of inspiration or advice you'd like to leave them with today?
Well, I think that I would like to reach out to those young people who've led disadvantaged lives economically, socially, ethnically, people who have not had opportunities. And I don't know whether they will be listening to your show or not, but maybe some of their teachers would be, or their mentors. We need to be mindful of what a person who comes from those backgrounds may not be thinking they can do, what potential they have. And I think for myself, had not people seen that in me, had not encouraged me, had not allowed me to grow with them, I would not be where I am today. It has always struck me, particularly ever since I learned about how people had to reach out and help me in a family that did not really benefit from that as I was growing up. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that and try to be observant. I love it when young people come into the office who are just starting their careers and try to understand, where are they in their travels? Where are they in terms of their development as thinkers? What are they thinking of themselves? What are they thinking that they could do? Are they dreaming big? Are they really thinking that they could do something far beyond what they currently think about? So I think that's our responsibility to give back to them. So I would just encourage the mentors of young people to remind themselves that not everybody comes to college or to science or to whatever profession they happen to wander into with a really good understanding of what opportunities await them if they will dig in a little bit, spend some time learning about the field, talk to other people, get engaged. Even to encourage one person can make a big difference, just like JFK said.
Absolutely. And for any of our listeners out there who are aspiring scientists but maybe have doubts, there are so many mentors out there like Randy here who are happy to open their doors and answer questions and maybe give you the little boost of encouragement you need. So fantastic note to end on, Randy. Can you tell our listeners, if they want to learn more about you and what you do, where should they go?
Well, they can visit my lab website. It's www.blakeleylab.org. They can also visit the FAU Brain Institute's website to learn about what we're doing here at our university to grow neuroscience education and research. Those are two good ways to check in with me.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely check out those websites and learn more about what Randy's working on and what's going on in the Brain Institute at FAU. And Randy, thank you so much for joining us on our program. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
You're very welcome.
Well, listeners, wonderful to have you here with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.